what are we going to do when we don't all have weekly telephone calls?
I know.
We should just put them in. We're going to
Yeah,
get
no,
some survival crisis syndrome.
I almost deleted one and then I got quite upset about deleting it. And I hadn't promised to do it yet.
We need to start implementation of our recommendations.
I think we ought to at least have one of those meetings just in person to have some cake and coffee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I just hope cake and opium.
yeah. We should definitely do that.
Celebration.
Yeah.
Reflection.
Yeah, yeah.
I saw the NHSI statement is positive.
Is it?
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, from Dido.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really
yeah.
Well, it would be. What's
Yeah.
it not to be?
Oh, yeah. That presupposes a rational world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just something.
Take yourself off.
Hello, how are you? See you. Very well. You have. Yeah. Can you check it?
No, do you Oh yeah, I shall shuffle them. Mary, Jean, no, Ellen is still out there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Sneak through there, that's what's up.
Yeah, cool.
Just waiting for the last few to come in. We're on our spare seat hunt. Great. Well, let's kick off, everybody. I think there's still some somewhere on the other side. Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Murray. I'm Chief Executive here at the King's Fund. Welcome to our breakfast event where we launch, well, the clues on the screen, closing the gap, key areas for action on the health and care workforce. Before we get going, just a very few words of housekeeping. There's no planned fire alarm. If it goes off, follow the directions of King's Fund staff, but it's basically go out of the building and go left. You can see the Wi-Fi network, 11 Cavendish Square. The password is Vermilion. Feel free to tweet #NHS Workforce. So I've actually worked at the King's Fund for a few years now, and every now and again we come together with our colleagues in the Nuffield Trust and the Health Foundation. But we've done it this time in a very different way. This is actually a full-scale report. If there are hard copies around, you'll realise just how full-scale it is. It's a very weighty tome, and we have the overview around, I hope, too. Why have we done it? We published in autumn last year on the NHS workforce make or break, trying to highlight the challenges facing the NHS and indeed broader social care workforce as well, and then have come back together this year to try and publish on a number of key actions, trying to be helpful, so much as a shroud waving, but things that we think that can be done to improve the situation on the workforce. It's not intended to be a comprehensive workforce strategy for the healthcare system in England. It targets specific areas and specific issues. And one of the things we've struggled with, which I'm sure Dido Harding and others are struggling with at the moment, is how, given the number of issues people want to raise about the workforce, can you convert that into a meaningful and actionable strategy? So, what we'll do today is hear from three of the authors in turn: Anita Charlesworth, Director of Research and Economics at the Health Foundation, then Candace Imison, Director of Workforce Strategy at the Nuffield Trust, and then Helen McKenna, Senior Fellow at the King's Fund. We won't take questions as we go through, we'll just run straight through. And then we're very fortunate today to have Donna Kinnair, Chief Executive at the Royal College of Nursing, and Nikki Kanani, the Director of Primary Care at NHS England. And they'll say a few words before we open up for questions, and we will close at 9:45. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Anita.
I'm really sorry I sound like I've been in a smoke-filled room with Jean-Claude Juncker. I haven't. I just have a husband who's a teacher and 4 kids, so I'm a super spreader. But hopefully you'll be kinder to me than the House of Commons were to Theresa May. In the time-honoured tradition of presentations from me, I'm doing the numbers. What I'm going to run through, first of all, is a reminder of the scale of the challenge we face, and then our thoughts on ways of closing that. So this is the chart we published back in March, which shows, so the solid green line is the number of full-time equivalent staff in the NHS, which has been rising, but had a blip, obviously, in the early part of this decade. It is still rising, so when ministers in the department say we have more staff, that is true. The trouble is that the black line shows the demand for staff, the number of staff that we project we need. And as we know at the moment, the gap between the supply of staff and the demand for staff is around 100,000 full-time equivalents. Demand doesn't stand still in the NHS, and so we did some work, the Health Foundation with the IFS, project forward demand, based very much on figures which are consistent with the long-term plan, and you get the dotted black line. You project forward the supply line, which is that dotted dark green line, and the graph grows to 250,000. And actually, if some of the recent trends we've seen in things like retention, early retirement were to continue, you could get an even larger gap of 350,000 over the decade. And so that is a challenge that we, all of us involved in healthcare at the moment, are trying to wrestle with. And what we've done in this piece of work is to take 2 key staff groups that contribute substantially to that gap. So one is nursing, and the other is primary care. We're not saying these are the only staffing problems in the NHS. We've looked at those 2, one because the gap between supply and demand seems particularly serious in those areas. Also, if you look at the long-term plan, having enough nurses, having enough GPs, both of these are critical to realising the vision in the plan. So that's why we focused where we did. So the first thing to do then, starting with nursing, and in this chart we look at 3 time periods. So where we are today, where we expect to be in 5 years' time, 23-24, which aligns obviously with the funding commitment, and then 28-29, so a decade's time. And this is nursing, and in the green bar I show what will happen to demand for nursing. And at the moment then, this is the supply position. Just to point out, we have a shortfall at the moment. My number there is 32,500. You may all be familiar with NHS Improvement's number of over 40,000. My number's slightly lower because I'm using NHS digital data. They are in fact completely consistent there. What we see going forward then over the next 5 years is the dark bar in supply is with no policy action. It's basically that we are running to stand still. It's that without further policy action, we'll have, broadly speaking, the same number of nurses in 5 years' time that we have today. That might not sound like a crisis. The problem is we already start with a shortfall in that context, and demand continues to grow. So what that means actually is that the gap between supply and demand would broadly double in 5 years' time if we take no action, and continue to grow out to 28, 29. The really good news, I think, because it is incredibly easy to be pessimistic when you look at the workforce, and I produce a lot of numbers that are a source of some of that pessimism. I'm out of my comfort zone today because there is some really good news here, I think, which is that actually it does not have to be like that. That actually, if we took action now, concerted action across a range of different levers to influence nursing supply, we think that we could have enough nurses in England in 10 years' time to meet supply. And actually, that's a fantastic position to be in. All is not lost at all, and we shouldn't be fatalistic about it. Over the next 5 years, though, we don't think that it's possible to fully close the gap. Looking at domestic supply, we think with policy action we could increase supply by around 26,500 staff. That would leave us still with a bigger shortfall than we have today, 40,000, but that's before international recruitment. So one of our key messages on nursing is act today so that we can get out of this vicious cycle. But over the next 5 years, if we're to make serious inroads into vacancies, then we need sustained international recruitment. And we think if we could grow international recruitment of nurses to around 5,000 a year, we could halve the vacancy gap for nursing over the next 5 years. So that's nursing. If we look at GPs, the current position is broadly the same, one of shortage. The outlook is very different, we think. So again, exactly the same, demand and supply, 3 time periods today, 5 years and 10. So we estimate that there's a shortfall today of around 2,500 GPs. Again, we actually have here a trajectory without policy action of actually slightly declining GP numbers. And we have growing demand. Actually, this is a pretty conservative picture. I've been bullish, actually, on early retirement, and I think there are reasons to believe it could be worse than I projected. Some of the supply line could be worse. And also, this is based on demand for current services. I haven't really factored in all of the vision for primary care that might see it taking on a much bigger role. Here, with policy action, we do think it's possible to grow the number of GPs, but nowhere near enough to close the gap. So on general practice, argue that actually what we need to do is really move substantially towards the team-based model of general practice, so that more of the activities that are covered within general practice are provided by other members of the team. And we need to do that quickly and really at some scale, that to happen. All of that then requires a lot action. Some actions don't cost money. Sad fact of life is that lots of actions do cost money. As we've seen, this is HEE's chart on what's happened to funding for the NHS and funding for the national pot for education and training. And as you can see, we are investing less as a share of our budget in the training and development of our staff. And that must be part of why we're in the problem we're in. And it's very difficult to see us getting out of that without reversing that and reinstating some of those cuts. And so we've costed up. I am a former Treasury official. We've costed up the proposals in our report. estimate that taken together, they would require, in 5 years' time, around £900 million extra to be added to the HEE budget. That basically takes it back to the share of health spending that was devoted to central investment in education and training that we had in 13-14 when the current structure of ALBs was set up. So it's a lot of money, but actually it reflects a priority for education and development of our staff which was the priority that we started with back in 13-14. So it's a lot, but it's not radical in that sense. So I will now hand over to Candace and Helen to explain the policy measures that sit behind that.
Thanks, Anita. So I'm going to touch on 3 things, which are some of the key areas of action. It's not everything that's in the report. So nurse training and retention, which clearly are critical to closing the nursing gap, but also workforce skills and redesign. And I suppose, by way of preface on the workforce skills and redesign, a key message from our report is that this isn't just about growing numbers, it's about growing skills as well. Both are needed in our workforce. So by way of context around nurse training, a crucial action, we believe, that was a bit of an own goal for us was the removal of bursaries. The intent around removal of bursaries was that it would actually facilitate an expansion in nurse training. And what we've seen is a decline in numbers of 4% and a much more significant decline in the number of applicants. And we have a picture across the country where some nursing schools are struggling to fill places, and that's particularly true for postgraduate nursing, where we've seen very sharp declines in the number of applicants, and some courses even struggling for sustainability, and particularly around learning disability and mental health nursing. A really important piece of context for nurse training is the very high rates of attrition we have, which is distinctly different from some of our other courses, particularly medicine. So for every 5 nurses that start training, the NHS will only actually benefit from 3 in terms of full-time equivalent. And here, crucially, this is a key bit of context, is that finances are proving to be a really significant factor, both in terms of the applicants, but also in terms of attrition. And something that many of you will be aware of is that when nurses are in training, they do not have the time to do the work outside of training that other students do, and that puts them at a particular disadvantage. The other issue we've had around nurse training is around clinical placements, in that trusts have not always been able to offer expansion in clinical placements. And one of the things that we highlight in our report is that the incentives for trusts to offer clinical placements are remarkably small, particularly when you compare them to medicine. So here are a few of our key proposals. So the big flagship proposal is that we believe all nurses in training should get a cost of living grant, which would help support them and compensate for that fact that they can't do work outside their course. So it's much, much, much harder for them. And then crucially for that postgraduate course, where we've seen the real decline in numbers, then you would be funding tuition fees as well as giving the financial support for cost of living. We're arguing that you should improve the incentives for clinical placements and potentially rebalance the budgets between medicine and nursing. And then an area that has been really interesting to dive into, but I have to say slightly depressing, is apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are often offered up as an area that really opens up opportunities to have the skills escalator that was envisaged way back in the early 2000s, bringing in people from the local community, giving them the skills that they need, and then crucially filling our workforce gaps. But at the moment, the apprenticeship levy is very inflexible in the way that it can be used, And crucially, from an employer's perspective, they can't use it to pay for backfill. And so if an employer was wanting to put a nurse through training using the apprenticeship levy, as well as the sort of loss they've got to the levy, it would cost them £140,000 versus the traditional getting somebody out of training and you've had to make no investment at all. So it really isn't working for employers. On retention, as Anita referred to several times in her presentation, one of the big issues we're facing in workforce at the minute, which is making the challenge of bridging those gaps so particularly difficult, is the fact that we've seen declining retention. More people are leaving the workforce than entering it in. We've seen it particularly happen in nursing, where the numbers have gone up by 25% in the space of 6 years, which is a very short amount of time. And we're watching indicators that suggest to us that work-life balance, stress in the workforce are contributing to that. And then we've got a scenario within general practice where GPs are taking early retirement, an extraordinary 62% of GPs taking early retirement, which clearly we think is a factor of pensions, but also the work-life balance issues. So here, there is a lot that can be done, which actually is about employment practice, is about how we manage and support and nurture our staff, recognise the challenges that they're facing. And this is where you need to combine this really strong management and nurturing of staff alongside bridging those workforce gaps. We need to move from the vicious to virtuous cycle, and this is a key part of it. And something that we've flagged particularly in the report is that we believe supporting and addressing inequalities in our workforce is a critical part of that too. So any of us who've looked at RES statistics, they are really frightening. We need to address the pay and progression gaps that we've got in our workforce. And crucially, we need to address these pension incentives which aren't working in the right way either. I mentioned at the beginning that we mustn't just see this as about numbers. It needs to be about skills too. We have a scenario where medical and technological advances are going to require new skills in all of our workforce. That's at 1.4 million people. At the moment, the budget per head is 76. So that's the glorious sum that we have available per head in our NHS workforce. It is woefully inadequate. We have some opportunities in our workforce that are not being exploited to their full. So physicians associates who are a new stream into our workforce who can do a huge amount at the moment are being hugely handicapped by the fact that they can't prescribe. We do highlight in our report the important issues around safe staffing. I know that where people have deep concerns around some of the changes in skill mixes, will they be safe? Well, we need to test whether they will be safe, so we need evidence there. And as I was saying, the workforce development budget really needs to be addressed. So here, our key proposals are that the workforce development budget should be at least quadrupled, which would take it to 334 million by 23-24. Physicians associates should be regulated. We know that there's government support for that, but they haven't got legislative time at the minute. And an area that we flag that is critical is around the advanced practice, where at the minute we have a lot of confusion about titles and numbers in advanced practice, and so we're suggesting that you should consider more formal national regulation here. We do recognise the loss of work that is happening nationally to support credentialing and the Academy of Advanced Practice, but we question whether that is enough. And supporting the ongoing evidence around safe staffing we see is key. And with that, I'll hand over to Helen.
Thanks, Candice. So I'm going to briefly outline some of our recommendations relating to pay and reward, also workforce redesign in primary care and international recruitment. in the NHS workforce. And then I'm also going to say a little bit about the social care workforce. So starting with pay. Pay is the single biggest cost in the NHS, so over £50 billion is spent on it. And so if it's used well, it can be a significant lever to attract and incentivise staff. However, it's also one of the first things that gets squeezed when funding is tight. And that's exactly what we saw happen in recent years. So between 2010-11 and 2018, pay was capped or frozen, and that meant that staff saw real terms cuts to their salaries. And while we know that pay isn't the main reason why people choose to work in the NHS, we do know that it has an impact on staff experience, and we saw that in NHS staff survey results. Obviously, since then we've had the new pay deal, and that's ended the cap on pay increases at least until 2020-21. However, we're recommending that beyond that date, pay will need to continue to rise in real terms in line with earnings in the wider economy. Otherwise, the positive effects of the new pay deal that we're starting to see now could come undone pretty quickly and have a negative impact on retention and staff morale. Time is tight, so I'm just going to pull out a couple more points from this slide. So again, given the scale of pay as a lever, we also think that the NHS pay review body and the Department of Health and Social Care could be a lot smarter in terms of how it uses pay to target problems. So for example, it could use incentives such as pay premia and golden hellos to tackle shortages in specific staff groups. And then I also just wanted to highlight pay gaps. So since 2018, all large organisations have been required to publish data on their gender pay gap, and this has highlighted pay gaps favouring men across many different staff groups. And this problem is compounded when it comes to many ethnic groups, and that's fundamentally inconsistent with the values of the NHS. And so we recommend that much more needs to be done to understand why this is happening, and then action needs to be taken to address that. So moving on to workforce redesign in primary care. Candace has already spoken about workforce redesign in acute settings, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's needed in primary care. So as Anita said at the beginning, the NHS currently has 2,500 fewer GPs than it needs, and we project that that gap is going to widen, or could widen considerably over the next 10 years, so a shortage of around 11,500 by 2028-29. We know that the government's been making efforts for some time to increase the number of GPs, and we absolutely think that these efforts need to continue. We need many more GPs, and they can't just be replaced. But being realistic, in the meantime, we need to look at other solutions if primary care is going to be able to manage rising demand over the coming years. So in our report, we look at opportunities to expand the multidisciplinary team in primary care. Specifically, we suggest that by recruiting at least 3,000 more pharmacists and 6,000 more physiotherapists into general practice, and also increasing the number of admin and clinical support staff, we think the gap between supply and demand could be bridged, and some of that current pressure in general practice could be absorbed. And this isn't just about relieving pressure on GPs, this is also about providing patients with the most appropriate care as well. We think that physios and pharmacists can provide some of that direct care to patients in the most appropriate way. And then just to add that in the report we focus on physios and pharmacists in part because of the sheer numbers of staff that exist in those groups, but also because at a national level the future supply of these groups looks very strong. I think also we're saying that on pharmacists, 3,000 is our lower end estimate, so we think there's potential to go much further if we could draw on community pharmacists. But there are also opportunities for others to contribute to the primary care team, so for example paramedics, nurses and mental health staff. It's important, I guess, just to emphasise that we're not saying GPs can be replaced, and we're saying that given the gap between supply and demand, if we want to ensure primary care remains sustainable and reduce the pressure on GPs, we should make use of other professionals who are well placed to take on some of the tasks that GPs currently do. And this is our infographic, it's in a report too. So on the left-hand slide is our depiction of the kind of traditional model of primary care the right-hand side is where we think it's headed. In some places it's already happening, and the national bodies also think this is the way forward. So you will have seen the recent announcement by NHS England who plan to make funding available for an extra 20,000 staff in general practice, and we welcome that. Although it's now about putting that into practice quickly, and doing that is going to involve tackling some big issues. Just moving on to international recruitment. So again, as Anita said in her introduction, if the actions that we set out in the report are implemented, then we think that nursing supply will broadly match demand in around 10 years' time. But in the short term, the picture is much, much more challenging. And so we project that in 2023-24 we would be around 40,000 nurses short of what we need. And the only realistic way of reducing this gap in the short term, as we see it, is to recruit internationally. So we're recommending that the NHS should aim to recruit an additional 5,000 nurses a year from now until 2023-24. That sounds huge, but it has been done before. Back in 2001-2, the NHS recruited 8,000 nurses. Obviously, it won't be easy, and we make a number of recommendations in the report about how that could be made easier. So, for example, we say that national bodies should cover the costs of that are currently paid for by local NHS employers and staff themselves around visa costs. And we're also recommending that beyond nursing, the government adds all healthcare professions to the visa shortage occupation list, and then that staff are exempted from the proposed £30,000 salary threshold. So, just finally, while social care isn't the focus of our report, we are very mindful of the close relationship between the NHS and the social care workforce. And throughout our work, we've sought to ensure that the recommendations we make do not involve the NHS drawing additional staff from social care, particularly when social care is currently experiencing such serious shortages. So it has itself over 110,000 vacancies right now. And we do know that finding and recruiting staff in social care is currently a huge problem. And there are a number of issues behind this. So there is the status of the sector and public perception. But one of the biggest issues is pay and conditions, which are typically worse in social care than in the NHS. And that means that often people working in social care are attracted over to the NHS. And that again illustrates the interdependencies between the two sectors. And so for that reason, and because the direction of travel is towards integrating those two systems, we recommend that NHS England supports local systems to plan their workforce much more collaboratively across health and social care. And then just to say that I haven't mentioned Brexit yet. So Brexit represents a really serious threat to the social care workforce in particular, actually. So 8% of people currently working in social care come from other EU countries, and the majority of them earn well under the proposed salary threshold of £30,000. And the solution the government has currently proposed to deal with this, which is a 12-month temporary visa, it's not going to work in social care because the job in social care is about long-term relationships with service users, between care workers and service users, and that's just not feasible, a 12-month visa. So we're recommending that the government goes back to the drawing board and designs a sector-specific visa route that works for social care. And then obviously, just much more fundamentally, the government needs to reform social care funding, and in the meantime, we'll need to see a proper plan for social care funding in the 2019 spending review. So just to close, those are the areas I was going to run through. I think in conclusion, we'd say there are no silver bullets. The situation with the workforce right now and projecting into the future doesn't look great, but we do think there are things that can be done. That's what we say in our report. And there's an opportunity to do something about it. So the NHS Workforce National Steering Group, or whatever it's called, is currently working on a workforce implementation plan that's going to come out later in the year, and we hope that these recommendations will be useful as they consider what goes into it.
Anita, Candace and Helen. Let me turn straight away to Donna for your thoughts.
So, really welcome the report, and it's really good to see the three eminent think tanks concur concurring with what I think the RCN has said for a long time about nursing. So thank you for your support here. I think it's really, really a good report. But one of the concerns that we have as the nursing body is how we got to this place. And we do think it's because there isn't a proper span of accountability around workforce planning. Because I think some of the things that we have seen consistently throughout time means that people have taken decisions that have impacted elsewhere, and there has been very little coherence. So we'd be asking for coherence across the system in terms of planning. I think the other thing to recognise is that the undergraduate and postgraduate supply of nurses supplies the whole of the workforce. So that's social care, and at the moment we're concerned that the numbers reflect that, because actually if you're going to get a nurse in the NHS, that's one thing, but actually it's the same trained nurse that goes and works in social care. I think, and those also supply care homes, and just think about the knock-on effect of that. So actually if you haven't got nurses in care homes, that you're getting the backup supply. Our concern is that this nursing should have been a priority. It should have been a priority for consideration in terms of the long-term plan, because it has the biggest numbers and it has the most impact on patient care. So we would have expected, you know, while we understand the primary care workforce, nursing throughout the whole system is truly relevant, because actually it's them that delivers the care to patients. The other interesting thing is CPD. Without CPD, we're not going to generate the skills that we need for the change and the technology enhancement that we need to deliver. And so that is hugely crucial in terms of the way in which the cuts to the CPD budget have happened. I think we have seen the impact of not doing anything. So while we've expanded nurse training routes, we have some expansion, that has not led to the numbers that we should have had. And what we've seen particularly is that has robbed from our healthcare assistant workforce. And while we, laud the training that has been delivered to these individuals because it helps them with their skills, that has not seen the overall expansion. So just creating lots of different routes doesn't lead to the necessary expansion. I think we've seen at the same time that actually money has come out of nursing and gone into the medical training budget. So let's just call that out, because not that we want to be in competition, but that is a reality, and you can see the size of the numbers that we are talking about. And actually, without nurses being able to deliver frontline care, it's not going to happen. I think pay, well, we've seen the impact of pay, and 25% turnover on frontline care is more than pay. It is about terms and conditions. It is about women in the workplace and not having family-friendly policies. It is the inflexibility of our system. So I think that there is so much more to be done, actually, in terms of making sure that people can take a part-time job and are respected in that part-time job, and given the skills and the encouragement. And that is across all the workforces. So it's not just nursing. It'll be, more than 50% of the medical workforce will require the same thing. I think, so we're really up for looking at how the NHS values and supports its staff. And actually what's really important is that we have the honest conversation. It has felt to me over the last few years that we've been speaking in a vacuum. So everybody is not quite having the necessary conversation. And actually sometimes when you're trying to speak truth to power, you're just sat on, because people end up being afraid to say things because everybody has an answer, but actually we can see the numbers running away with themselves, and that's the reality. The other thing that I'd say is that I am concerned about one thing in the report, and that's the differentiated pay. Because I think that just leads to people, as we've seen, you put differentiated pay in and everybody runs to mental health, and that just depletes the general workforce. And that's why we've taken the stance that you've got to increase the supply of all undergraduate routes. Because actually this whole thing about, yes, let's just get everybody doing extra training in mental health, or let's just get everybody running to disability, is is a worry for me, because actually when you increase supply, you actually have enough to go across the spectrum. And the other thing that I'd say is that one of the biggest worries is if we lose the training courses, they take forever to rebuild. So we're in crisis now. We know that there's hardly a university in the country that is wanting to offer disability nurse training. And yet, the crisis is now, because actually, even though it takes 3 years, if we don't do something about that now, they're gone, and we have to start rebuilding them all over again. So I think that we are really clear that we expect accountability for the workforce. We have seen such a fragmented approach and policy decisions that impact on one another, to the detriment of being able to deliver safe care for our patients. So we do want to know who is accountable. And I do think for us, while we've got the predicted numbers, my experience of 33 years in the nursing profession tells me that actually sometimes the reality is very different from the prediction. And so I understand that we can only deal with prediction, but it's always been a shortfall to what I'm dealing with at the end of the day. So I just think that those are some of the thoughts we have. We absolutely welcome it, because it is echoing the thoughts and voices that we've been trying to lend to for some time. So my thanks to the group. Think tanks.
Thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank you. And so I woke up this morning and read the newspapers very quickly, who were reflecting on this report, which is quite impressive considering the other things that the newspapers have been focusing on. So well done. And I was equally terrified, but sort of unsurprised as well, because we know that this has been happening. We know that this has been creeping along, and I am going to focus on general practice and a little bit on primary care, because that's what I'm here to do, but I completely support everything that my colleague has said, and I will speak truth to her power as well. I'm also grateful that Helena said about 3 times that GPs are not replaceable, because A, that would put me out of a job, but also actually that is a really important point, and I know that my colleagues at RCGP have made that point as well. So what this report does is give us a credible burning fire pit for us to do all of the things that we've started to describe this year. So the long-term plan, the contract, which I could talk about for ages, I won't, but the contract, which is a huge enabler if we get it right, if we deliver it right, and this emerging people plan, because this emerging people plan has meant that certainly everyone to do with general practice, every professional body, every organisation, everyone who's thinking about general practice has been on a weekly telephone call every week for the last 10 weeks or something, Becky, and we're going to do that all through the summer, because we can't shy away from the challenges that you've set out. We can't. What this doesn't talk about is how dark some of the days are for my colleagues, and I appreciate it'll be the same for some of your colleagues, Donna. I've had GPs call me who say that they don't want to carry on, they can't carry on, that they are not sure that they can look after their patients because they can't look after themselves anymore. So we know that it is really quite awful out there, and actually the ability to be flexible is within all of our gifts. So I had a GP call me last week from the Midlands. She said that because she was undergoing fertility treatment, she was told she was a disgrace to the profession. So I'm going to start calling these things out, because actually they matter. There's a huge amount that we can do with additional funding, but actually there's a huge amount that we have within our gift right now. And I mean, your report on compassionate leadership, what was that, 2 years ago now? We could be talking about the same report in terms of the actual asks that we have to make on the system, which is all of us in this room, in our national group, as we develop and publish the people plan, have to talk about compassion, have to show compassion, have to talk about flexibility and demonstrate it, and realise that actually the people that we're talking about are autonomous professionals who are very capable of working at the top of their licence if we relax some of the grip that we have and allow them to do so. So, I mean, particularly, just a couple of points. The long-term plan does set a vision for primary care. I find it helpful, actually. It's the first time that we talk about primary care in quite a strong way. So I describe it as the primacy of primary care because it is right there and it is focused and it is central. We recognise the role of primary care in all of its constituent ways. Because primary care is changing and our population is changing, and that's a bit that I just want to focus on. So I had a patient that came in a few weeks ago and she brought baby with her, and straight away I was like, oh, is this my unwell child today? Baby looked fine, mum looked fine. Mum had a folder and it was about that thick, a white folder, and it was the full genomic sequencing of babies' cord blood. And she said, Dr. Kay, what do you think? And I went, I don't know. And so it's full of mutations and genes and probabilities, and genuinely I didn't know what to tell her. She pushed me again and she said, but baby's going to be hard of hearing. It says baby's going to be hard of hearing. And I was like, you've had your hearing test, we're not worried. More worryingly, she said, well, baby, it says baby might be lactose intolerant. Shall I stop breastfeeding? So the conversation is different. It is changing, and it will change faster than we realise. And it's past sort of top Holland. You know, I sit in surgery every week, and I see people asking for different things from us as a team. So coming on to the team description on, I think it's on page 19 of the report, that is absolutely the way we have to go, because actually we have to get the offer right for our patients and our public, but we also need to support our struggling workforce with the very best of the additional roles that we've described. So in the contract, we've picked out a number of roles that we know we have a pipeline for, who actually are often much better placed to see patients than we are in general practice, as GPs. So we've set out a plan over the next 5 years to deliver 20,000 additional staff, as you mentioned, so that's clinical pharmacists, physiotherapists, social prescribing link workers, physicians associates and paramedics. So I think that is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution, it's part of the solution. And then through the people plan and through the work that we're doing across the professional bodies, we're looking at how we recruit more. And I think we need to think about how we do that geographically and sensibly to make sure that actually training happens in the right space at the right time, because actually some coastal areas are just not getting any trainees. And I was talking to some programme directors recently in inner city London. If you are training, you will be part of maybe 40 GPs training with 6 programme directors, but in some of the coastal areas you might be 200 GPs training with 2 programme directors. So the quality and the variation is huge. So we do have to think about that, but I think we've got lots within our gift. So I think the discussion will be much more important. I'm going to just wind up by saying we all have a role to play. We also don't have a choice. We absolutely don't have a choice. So compassion, flexibility, autonomy, and let's start having a conversation about what we really want to prioritise.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to stand back up again so I can see you all as the hands begin to go up. So we'll take questions. I'll probably take 2 or 3 at one go. If you could say who you are for the rest of us, that would be very helpful. So we've got a hand up over there and one at the back.
Hi, yes, Andrew McCulloch. Very good report, and yes, totally agree with everything everybody said. Can I put in a plea to treat skill mix issues as a creative positive rather than a crisis solution? I'm not suggesting anyone on the panel thinks that, but I think out there sometimes it's seen as, oh God, we're going to have to use that loaded word of dilute the skill mix. Actually, when you're talking about patient-centred care, there's so many creative things that all sorts of people can do in primary care and secondary care, if you're looking at issues like educating people, helping them to get to exercise, hydrating them. Well, I've said enough, I think. Thanks.
Oh, hello, I'm Debbie Frost. I'm a GP, as well as being Associate Medical Director at NHS England in London. I just wanted to really welcome this report because a lot of it's really, really interesting. But I just wanted to give three I suppose examples of things that I've seen in practice. Last week I was speaking to both one of my partners who's in his late 30s, already coming to the end of his pension pot, and therefore thinking of cutting down his hours because he doesn't need to do that anymore. I spoke to all my salary GPs because I look after them, and they're finding the paperwork very difficult. We've cut it down by having admin staff doing a lot of it, but in the end, unless there's regulation of the other physicians' assistants and associates, we won't be able to hand the really difficult stuff onto them, including prescriptions. And finally, last year at the Confederation Conference, I did mention the fact that we've had for several years, we've had postgraduate student nurses coming into our practice for a year. The funding was paid for up until this year. It wasn't paid for this year to make it equal over London, which is fair enough. But it meant that we didn't take a postgraduate nurse on for training, and therefore we haven't been able to offer another one the job as we did last year. So it's just to give some examples.
Lady just here.
Hello, I'm Julie Pearce, I'm the Director of Nursing Quality at Marie Curie. And thank you very much for the reports, absolutely fabulous, and I absolutely concur with the comments of the panel. I think the other aspect of this that we probably just need to be aware of is that the voluntary sector is also part and parcel of the system, and some of that is very much interdependencies and collaborative ways of working between the NHS, social care and the voluntary sector. So I guess my thoughts about that are that we shouldn't forget that, because there are opportunities around that in terms of how the workforce is redesigned. And I think the other aspect of that that we perhaps need to think about, we need to be more creative and imaginative about how we employ people and how we describe what their capabilities and competencies are, but also how their career progression and choices they can make, how we fully express that without putting the organisational constraints and barriers that currently persist in our systems. And in order to do that, people in leadership positions have to take some risks, and we have to collaborate and talk to each other about it to find solutions.
Great, thank you very much. Back to the panel, some questions there, some points around skill mix. The pensions issue has raised its head. I don't know if at least on the skill mix side, whether Candace or Helen would like to speak.
Well, I suppose on the skill mix side, I'm just grateful for the amplification of the points. I mean, I couldn't agree more in the work that we did with NHS employers, where we looked at some of the opportunities around skill mix. An absolute central point from that work is that this is a way of improving things for everyone if you get it right. So I just applaud the comments. I mean, Nita, do you want to comment on the pensions?
Yeah, I'll comment on the pensions, but I think the points made from the examples from primary care in London are actually as well, I think, really important to think about. That once we're talking about individual policies, what is absolutely clear if we're going to change the situation is that unfortunately this isn't about focusing on one policy, it's about getting the whole mix right. So making the NHS a better place to work, improving retention, comes from a whole combination of initiatives that get the hygiene factors, used going Maslow's right, which is things like the pension, but really get quality of work right as well. Quality of work, really important, get relationships right. And so I think one of the complexities and for NHS improvement leading on the workforce plan is it's often easier to deliver and focus on single initiatives, but really what we're talking about is years of integrated action holistically, and the funding flows for postgraduate support well made. On the Marie Curie point, I think firstly, absolutely, I mean, in our numbers we've focused on increasing supply, in part because what we've done over the last couple of years is one sector steal staff, frankly, from another sector, that's both within and between. More important than that, in the placement where we talk a lot about thinking a lot more about where people train and the range of experiences. In our pay section, we also think that the time has come for the review body and department to have a good look at the way in which terms and conditions between sectors are aligned and some of the barriers they make. Now, harmonising everyone is hugely problematic and risks creating a whole new set of problems. But actually we do need to look at the sector as a whole and begin to understand some of these interrelationships and at least map out where things like review body making really good changes through Agenda for Change for the lower levels on the pay bands. Good thing in its own right, really difficult for social care, and government just gets to ignore that because it's not clearly set out. On the pensions front, I mean, we're absolutely here, I'm looking at Danny, NHS employers. I think you've been talking about the local government 50-50 scheme. It seems to me that given where we are and the urgency of this, if there's a model that someone's developed that works, the advantage I think of that is that although we're very focused on the pension position for consultants and GPs with several years service, we also have an issue where for staff on lower salaries earlier on in their career, they're often trying to save a deposit for a flat while paying high rent, their pension contribution. I mean, it's great that it's deferred pay. They need somewhere to live now and a way to access that. So the 50-50 model, it seems, helps people, provides some flexibility to help people to balance pay and pension at different phases of their career. And so in the report we suggest that we get behind NHS employers and do that.
I just wanted to add as well, so I totally agree with your point about skill mix needing to be seen as a creative solution rather than a crisis solution. And I think, you know, this is about great patient care, and in some places it's already happening. And what this is about, I guess what's happening is that the crisis we're in has created the impetus to drive that creative solution and spread it further. So that's just what I would say on that.
Donna, Nikki, I didn't know, you don't feel you need to come in, but if you did want to say something before I throw it back open to the floor.
I'd just like to echo that certainly for nurses and many other professions, we have been, in terms of our advanced practice, clinical skills have been developing them for some time so that we can support. And it's interesting, I think, when we're looking at the GP solution, that actually they are some of the best people given to be able to support GPs in general practice, because particularly we have almost followed the model of medicine really in terms of advanced practice skills. So I think it's also quite important to know where you draw people from if you're talking about improved patient outcomes and patient safety. So I just add that to it.
Cool, go back again, I think Dilip at the front.
Thank you. Dilip Aliraja, Assistant Director of Policy and Campaigns at RCGP. So I think this is a really important and timely report, and particularly with the work of the People Plan and the spending review in mind, I think it's really important to not assume that the GP contract and the long-term plan has solved the kind of workforce problems in general practice. I think I can give you kind of 3 areas which still have to be addressed. One is if you're expanding the wider practice team, which absolutely has to be done, where are you going to house them? You know, so GP premises are not fit to house all these additional staff. So and the long-term plan is silent on that. So that's a big challenge. I think secondly, and you alluded to this in the presentation, training. You know, you need to train and develop this workforce, and obviously that wasn't part of the long-term plan. You know, we need something substantial in the spending review to address training, and I guess there's a kind of knock-on effect on GP capacity, which is who's going to do training, who's going to supervise placements, who are going to be the mentors. You know, GPs will also, you know, they won't be just sitting there kind of conducting an orchestra of kind of physios and nurses. They will have to be teachers and mentors. They have to be leaders. You know, the primary care networks will take up capacity. You know, just clinical directors alone, I think, will require about 300 full-time equivalent GPs, and so you need to be able to kind of build that capacity to lead, to teach, to mentor into projections about the workforce.
The lady, we've got 2 at the back, so we'll take the lady and then we'll take the gentleman.
Niamh Lennox Chigoni from Optimity. First of all, thank you so much for this. It's a fantastic report. Question for the panel about, you've clearly outlined what a lot of the national level initiatives need to be. I wonder what role you think the emerging ICSs could play. We know that there are some examples of really good practice out there in addressing workforce issues, there are organisations and systems that are doing some really great stuff in this space. What they're not able to do is deliver that at scale. So I just wonder what you think. Yes, there is stuff we have to do nationally to create a climate for change, but what could be done at ICS level?
And the gentleman, I think.
Hello, my name's Kalenza Thorpe from Unite the Union. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and it's a really good report. It's a much needed report, but you know, we've had lots and lots of reports over the past, I don't know how many years, and you know, let's be frank, it doesn't make much of an impact, really, does it? Because I think Helen was saying before, the last time there was 5,000 nurses that were recruited in the NHS was 2001. Can anyone guess what the increase in funding in the NHS was in 2001? Does anyone know? I know. It was 8%. Okay, 8%. Okay, and even though we all agree the extra money for the NHS from the Prime Minister from last June is welcome, it's not enough money. And everything you put in your report is not going to happen because there isn't the funds to deliver it. For example, with the fragmentation and the chaos the Health and Social Care Act of 2012 has delivered us, we've got all sorts of NHS services fragmented, whether it's the voluntary sector, private sector, local government. The local government, for example, has taken on health visiting and nursing, and they've seen cuts to health visiting and school nursing of over 15% in the workforce since 2015. So how are we going to have an integrated long-term plan when we've got such fragmented workforce systems, and it's not able to deliver what we want? And you've got to remember, this is just a sticking plaster. Remember, we've had 9 years of suboptimal NHS funding. It's going to take more than 9 years to put it back up. So is it really pie in the sky what you're talking? Because there's no chance from the comprehensive vending review we're going to get the funding we need, since local government services have been cut by 20% at least in real terms since 2010. So with your proposals about pay and the workforce, you know, from a trade union perspective, I can see Danny there as well. We've worked very well with NHS employers over the last few years regarding pay. And something that you talked about the pay review body being more flexible. There is flexibility. There already is something called recruitment and retention premiums, or any local trust could apply, but they're not able to apply that because why? They don't have the money to apply. So that's there already. So my question is really, how can you make this happen when the funding's not there and the whole system is fragmented and frankly broken and needs to be replaced? So, and what are your views really, whether this fragmented privatised system is the way to go forward?
Right, you're adding more questions. That was a bit of a portmanteau question. So we've got some points from Dilip on both on estates, training and development that's needed, and the support for GPs to do this. I mean, without cutting to the chase, yes. But I'm sure others will want to say more about it than that. Around ICSs, and a very fair point from Unite, is this doable? Is there enough money there? And I think there was actually echoing some points you made, Don, about the fragmentation. That part of the reason we've ended up in this state is some of the structures from 2012. So I do think there's some very important points. Nikki, I know you were.
Yeah, I think I could probably comment on all of those, but I mean, so gentleman at the back, sorry, I can't even see you. Just that's even with the heels on. But really good points. I think we all recognise the massive financial challenge here. I mean, I don't think that anyone here is surprised at what you say. So I think that's fair. But actually, that's broader than this, and I think we have to be really practical about what we can do. I've got a friend in state education, and she told me on Monday, she called me in tears because she had a patient, see everyone's a patient, a child come in who's 12, she's just found out has now got no parents at home and has been coming in of their own accord back and forth to school. So, I mean, things are really, really difficult. They're really difficult. So Dilip, on your point, you know what I'm going to say here, this is the beginning of a response. And it has to be seen like that, and we have to take that appropriate optimism, David, if David's there somewhere. David Hassam's reminded me, appropriate optimism, but we have to take this forward as a start, because it is the first start that we've genuinely seen for over a decade, particularly for primary care. On premises, we are doing a premises review, it'll be out this summer. my practice is a 2 up, 2 down. The thing that's helped us is digitisation. So we digitise all practices because actually that's going to relieve some space, but not all of it. But we have to look wider. So, lady at the back about what happens at system level. Let's look at estate at a primary care network level and at a system level and see what we can creatively do. Local authority has some really good options about estate, and that's what we factored in. One of the things in the people plan finally at an ICS level is the role of the training hub. So how do you do multidisciplinary planning, training, education so that you can support your staff now and actually look forward to what your staff will need for the future? And that's something that I think will be really critical in holding the system together.
There's a lot that I'd say yes, and yes, and clearly, but I think there is something about we have in a period of austerity, in a period that we've just come through, the NHS is still going. We are still seeing, all these millions of patients every single day, and that is because the workforce has pulled together and actually looked at the skills that they can share and deliver. So if you look at paramedics and what they've done to contribute to the care of patients, we are all expanding. So I'm a bit of an optimist. I do think it's possible, but I do think it's important that we recognise that we probably have peaked as much productivity as we can from the system without more funding. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think in times of austerity, I've seen some of the best services developed in the NHS because people know that it's got to be done and they pull together. That's not without recognising that we have to increase finances and supply.
I think I'd just add as well, for the gentleman at the back from United, just that you said, is it pie in the sky, the thing that we're saying. I think actually, I don't think the workforce crisis as currently being experienced is really the biggest issue facing the NHS and social care really. And actually, and funding being the social care issue as well. But I think politicians are aware of that. They've already invested the 20.5 billion extra funding into the NHS. I don't think that I hope that politicians won't let the crisis in the NHS get increasingly worse in terms of workforce. I don't think that's tenable, and I don't think the public would support it. So I am optimistic that necessary steps will be taken.
I just wanted to sort of combine, as actually in a way it already has, the issue about the level of investment we need at the front line to make this happen with the role of the ICS. I do think there are real opportunities at ICS level for creative partnerships with higher education providers, being the facilitators of train-the-trainer type initiatives. When HE at a local level works at its best, it's been a phenomenal enabler of change. It just hasn't been even across the patch, and we can often lose sight of some of the really good things that have happened. My own wish list would incorporate every single provider organisation having a workforce development capability within it to enable it to support the skill mix change that is needed, but crucially the ICSs can facilitate and support that.
So two things from me. I think the question about where the leadership is going to come at that ICS level consistently across the country in time is absolutely fundamental. And it's not just about willingness to do that, but actually we haven't for years done sort of workforce strategy, workforce support, workforce planning, system-wide on that sort of footprint in the NHS. Requires a set of people with skills and capabilities, with tools and access to support that we haven't got. So one of the tasks for national bodies is not just to organise themselves a lot better, and actually although we have a fragmented system legally, the law does not tell us that behaviourally national bodies need to pull apart. Yeah? So it is a choice for national bodies, even in a fragmented system, to behave as in a sack or come together and behave as a unified set of system leaders. So actually, even without legislative change, they can behave as one, even if they're legally 5 or whatever it is. So I mean, all the signs are that people like Dido Harding and David Behan are very clear that their job is to get everyone to behave as one. So that is a grounds for optimism. But how we go from some enthusiasts to actually a sustainable, supported model is really quite a challenge, and one of the critical things that the national bodies have a role to play. On the money, and having been in the Treasury once, I think one of the things, and the capital point is really well made as well, this state. It's a really good example of why shifting from looking at the health and social care budget as a whole to just signalling out NHS England was a bad idea if you want to spend money well. And so one of the things is we shouldn't do that again. But actually, I'm not without optimism. We've signalled that we think that we need about an extra £900 million. It is a lot, but actually without that £900 million, you really risk not being able to spend £20.5 billion well. And that's not a sensible place for any government to be, to invest a load of money and then tie its hands so it can't actually deliver the change it wants. Yeah? And we need to make that case very clearly. Also, if you look at all the satisfaction work that Nuffield and Kingsford have done, all of the work with the public, people can see the money alone, the reason why they're giving the money, apart from the fact that I think they do believe in the NHS, is because it matters to the electorate and it matters to people. But actually promising the money if there isn't the change on the ground won't deliver them the benefit with the people. And people are very clear when you speak to them at the moment. They see that shortages of staff are the #1 issue. That's the public's test as well. So, it is worth trying. Yeah, there are no guarantees, but it's worth trying to get this extra money.
And I'm going to allow one last kind of question from point, because Andrew's been waiting in the front, because we are right on the nail of time. They all come at once.
So thank you very much, and I'll therefore be relatively brief. I'm Andrew Sutcliffe, I'm the Chief Executive of the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Just like to echo the welcome for the report, and particularly because it is raising the profile of workforce issues, and obviously, like Donna, very pleased to see the focus on nursing. But it is acute focus. We need to not forget about social care, but also mental health, learning disability nurses. All of these people have a real contribution to make in terms of improving things. And just to pick up on the point about national bodies, I think that regulators have to play our part in all of that too, and we particularly have a part to play in terms of responding to the points you've made about international recruitment. And my final point is, this is not a kind of abstract, esoteric kind of conversation. As Anita's just said, this matters to people, because actually not having nurses, midwives, GPs, whatever it may be, impacts on people's care, impacts on their quality of life, and impacts on their ability to do the things that they want to do. So I think making sure that we're connecting it to the experience of people, as well as the focus on the practical things that we need to do, I think would be really helpful.
Brilliant. And on that point, I'm going to close. I was around for the NHS plan in 2000, and we did work then. So it was just as the 8% money began to flow, and we went and asked the public what they most wanted through a series of engagement events. People were thinking, will it be better cancer diagnosis or reduced waiting time? Top of their list was better paid NHS staff, and slightly took the politicians by surprise. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. I know there are a lot more questions, but we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you very much to Nikki and to Donna for coming along. That was incredibly helpful. And